G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. You've seen the title of this video. What we're going to speak about is what I believe is Ukraine's last chance, a very hard decision on mobilisation that needs to occur to try and stabilise this front line, to stop it moving west, or in the future to maybe have a chance at further offensive actions. But if this doesn't occur, well, I have a fairly pessimistic outlook on how the future is going to look. So what we're going to do is I'm going to state my case, and then at the end I'm going to give you a doctrinal breakdown of attritional war, and from this doctrine speak about this is why I have this opinion. War does not determine who is right, only who is left. And what sparked my interest to talk about this was this from a Ukrainian veteran and officer. Some Western analysts mistakenly assume Russia has already failed in Ukraine, believing Ukraine just needs to maintain its pace until Russia is exhausted. This ignores the risk of internal crises in Ukraine and Russia offsetting its demographic losses with occupied territories. Now, there is no secret that Ukraine has a manpower crisis on the front line. This leads to shortages of men on the front line. It leads to the average age of men on the front line being 40 to 50 years old. This, of course, then leads to a loss of territory, avoidable equipment losses, positions overrun, a morale problem at the front line, and a hesitancy for Western support. Regardless of what politicians are saying, there is, I believe, a hesitancy to supply more weapons, more systems, if Ukraine isn't willing to run or hold further mobilizations. And these mobilizations need to be very, very large. The first thing I think that needs to be accepted is that this is a war of attrition, not a war of maneuver. Both Ukraine and Russia have failed to reinstate maneuver into the battlefield on a large amount. Now, I think any doctrine that talks about how to bring maneuver back into a war is really on the cutting edge, but has no history to base off, because we have never had a war like this with drones and the ISR capability, if maneuver at the point like this in war is ever even possible to bring back in. So I think there has to be an exception of attritional war. Therefore, you need to have a positive balance of losses and absorption of those losses. We'll speak about the doctrine and what doctrine says about this. Now, I believe that Russia accepted this attritional phase well earlier on in this war. And now that we're 2 years from Russia's Kherson and Kharkiv failures, where they lost a lot of land, are winning the battle. This time frame, what I'll show you in the doctrine, does make sense. So I think early on, they had these huge losses, these runs into Kyiv, these runs in Kharkiv, Kherson, that ultimate failure there, that pullback and acceptance early, shit, this is attritional, this is how we need to do it. That's what I believe. In attritional war, manpower and the absorption of losses is it is the decisive factor in who will be victorious. And the Ukrainian command's hesitation to mobilise is responsible for the manpower situation that Ukraine is currently in. People will blame Western support, they'll blame this or that. There's no Western manpower support going in other than volunteers. So if you have a manpower problem, that is the command's, the officials' hesitation. But I don't believe that this was done in vain. Ukraine has had, well before the beginning of this war, a demographic crisis. And these leaders, they're trying to protect the younger generation who are not yet to have children, and can some try and fix this demographic crisis to a degree. This is why we've seen that only over 27-year-olds could be mobilised, and they dropped that down to 25. But I believe Ukraine's last chance is they need to mobilise and change the laws of these 18 to 25-year-olds. All those who wanted to volunteer and fight and are motivated, to the vast majority at least, they have already volunteered and are motivated. Why then 2.5 years into a war where the border is moving in the wrong direction for you, are you suddenly going to get motivated to go and fight? All those motivated have gone. That also creates another large problem. But, of course, Ukraine has not wanted to mobilise in this age bracket because of this demographic crisis, which, of course, the demographics the people are the future of their country. And with, say, 2 more years to go of war, 16, 17-year-olds now are very likely to be mobilised in the future. We're 3 years into this war, almost 3 years in. Some people who would have been 15 when the war has started could sign up or could be mobilised if the law is changed. And that is a brutal aspect of attritional war that I guess needs to be accepted. But this could be a real game changer in the Western states supporting the victory plan. How much of a game changer would it be on the front line? I don't know. I've yet to see how much these numbers could actually change things. But I think where the big change could be is the Western states looking at that commitment and further supporting of the victory plan, or more weapons deliveries, or opening up the ability for further strikes. Without doing this mobilisation, it shows hesitancy in which the West might go, well, we're not going to give more weapons. If you're hesitant about this, we'll be hesitant about that. And questions would be asked if Ukraine is not willing to show this commitment for the future of the war. And this was glaringly obvious in the US, with Zelensky's victory plan not gathering support in the US, really any allies publicly, especially then the point of to allow long-range strikes. It really fell flat. Now, even if mobilisation gets signed tomorrow, it would be, or should be at least, a minimum of 6 months before these troops actually were to show up on the front line. Any less than this, they would not have received enough training to conduct offensive operations. Defensive operations are one thing. Offensive operations are completely different. But once the first soldiers start to arrive, say 6 months, 3 to 6 months until they're on the battlefield, there needs to be a number of months set forward for experience to be gained amongst these troops before they're capable of conducting offensive operations. Training and experience both take time, but these are absolutely critical. If you feed these new guys into hotspots day one, you will lose them. You will lose the potential for further operations and survival. The reason I point out that is, let's go right here and now. Mobilisation gets signed on these age brackets. Minimum 6 months, if not more, before we see them rock up on the front line. Maybe 8 months before we see that they're capable of running offensive operations. That is a long way away. With the pace that Russia is moving, the momentum that they've got at the moment, it's going to be a far different battlefield by then also. And you can't just rely on Russia burning out and running out of steam, maybe on offensive actions, but then if they sit in defensive, it's still going to be one hell of a fight to break through any of this. This said, this is why I'm still not confident that this could completely turn the tide, but it could very potentially stabilise the front line. And with Ukraine's set goals in 1991 border, what is needed is not just to stop withdrawing currently. It needs a stabilisation, then an offensive action with a minimum of 3-to-1 advantage in manpower, in armour, in artillery, in munitions, all of this. That is one hell of a goal set forth. And without the mobilisation of this, there's no hope of that really happening. It's a very hard thing to talk about. I don't want to see people conscripted either. But I don't believe there's any other way if that's still your set goal. Now, including in this, and this is what I believe is one of the large concerns, that there is a scenario where Ukraine wins ground, wins territory, but at the expense of a future generation. And this could lead to just a series of Pyrrhic victories. The same concern is amongst the Russian forces as well. Now, with the available information that I have, we don't know the exact situation within Russia's ranks, and if a collapse that we've been being told is imminent for 2.5 years is really imminent or not. We don't know. But I believe Ukraine has two options moving forward. Either Ukraine needs to make a commitment to this conscription, or they need to look at ability to make a negotiation. I don't see how without this conscription that the front line can be stabilised, not only slowed and stabilised, but then moved the other way. And if there's not a willingness to do this, well, I believe there needs to be some look at how's another way to end this war. because it is unfair prolonging the suffering of the soldiers and the population if it's going to continue in the same fashion that we have seen for the previous 24 months, likely ending in the same positions or even worse than maybe current day, but years down the future of where there could have been rebuilding of both of infrastructure and population. And as the war continues, the longer and longer, more Ukrainians are going to leave. And the longer that these citizens are outside of the country, the less likely they are to return. And I think this also does heighten the risk of internal unrest. Down the line, months more, not then conscripting more people, not more volunteers, then bolstering the front line, you could see even more desertion off the front line, which we do know cases of desertion are increasing. And I believe even in the worst scenario, they could open the door to a possible like Wagner-esque rebellion. And this could be fueled as well through some Russian intelligence services and messaging, some propaganda too. And I believe this is even at a higher risk if the war settles in a position that is worse than actually the original peace negotiations back in Turkey. But this is the impossible calculation that Ukrainian officials have ahead. But making no decision is, I believe, the worst outcome. Russia currently occupies about 18.5% of Ukrainian territory, increasing this, though, month by month at an exponential rate. I believe that Ukraine can either settle and remain holding, say, 80%, maybe give or take, because we know the scenario at the front line that Russia is definitely on the upper hand, but giving this, they seek membership in institutions, start rebuilding infrastructure and population, and maybe look at diplomatic ways to return this territory. But maybe the guns fall silent. But this is making a very large assumption, and one that I have been incorrect in making before, I believe. Why would Russia be open to any, say, reasonable negotiation at this point in time? They just had their largest month of advancement in 2.5 years. And if I was a Russian officer, if I was an official, I would take it as if Ukraine is now, we're not negotiating, and then suddenly wants to negotiate, I would take that as an indication that the situation is unstable and critical. And I'd take that as a key to, well, we don't have much longer until we'll have more victories on the front line. Like I said earlier, we don't know the exact situation within the Russian ranks either. So I believe Ukraine needed to commit to that, some level of peace settlement process, or commit 100% to some total war mobilization and try to seize these territories in a military, tactical, strategic victory. But this is a gamble with the highest risks. This gamble, in my opinion, doesn't just threaten the troops going into combat, it threatens the other remaining 80% of land. If it fails, even worse, it jeopardizes the ability for the population to regenerate. It risks everything at that point. And is this all or nothing approach realistic? Well, we have seen that the commanders, the officials, aren't willing to, so far, mobilise and conscript within that 18 to 25. So at this point in time, this total conscription, total war, we're seeing that is not realistic. That gamble may not be worth it. But I believe the indecision will likely put Russia in a more powerful position before that decision is either made one way or the other. Month to month, it does seem that Russia is in a more and more powerful position. So let's look at these demographic ages, and this is the problems of which we are talking about. So the average age we hear on the front line is about 45, and you can see where the Ukrainian male demographic sits. And what I've said is below 25, these can't be conscripted. Between 18 and 25, how much different would the amount of men in here who are physically able to fight, but who are motivated as well? You can conscript someone, but if they're not willing to fight, well, they're not willing to fight. But I've even put down to 15 here, considering that we may have years and years more of war. People may ask about women in combat. Well, I was in the army when we opened up the infantry to women joining in a far more liberal country than Ukraine. And it was a complete failure. And this was in peacetime also. not only just from people not wanting to join, but also the amount of injuries as well significantly increased in lower body injuries just to different hip structure and carrying weight as well. One thing I've said in that is Ukraine is far, far more conservative to traditional gender roles also. So I don't believe that this is realistic as far as conscription. Of course, you can volunteer. But I speak about that fertility rate as well and this decrease in here. And could there be a tactical victory, but it be Pyrrhic because you've lost so many people trying to then recover these territories? It doesn't mean that Russia's not going to have massive problems as well, but we're talking about Ukraine here. How much hurt are you willing to take on to recover some of these areas, and is there ability to regenerate following this? Now, I said we'd speak about Doctrine. 40 new units into combat-capable soldiers instead of civilian mobs is done through training and combat experience. A new formation should train for at least 6 months, and only if manned by reservists with previous individual training. Conscripts take longer. Once initial training is complete, they should only be fed into battle on secondary theatres. No formation should be allowed to fall below 70% strength. Withdrawing formations early allows experience to proliferate among new replacements as veterans pass on their skills. Otherwise, valuable experience is lost. It's what we spoke about. If you feed these guys directly onto the zero line, either through KIA, WIA, or even just desertion or psychological issues, you will lose these guys and the valuable experience. You need to keep this turning, and you need to prioritise replacements over new formations, not just making formations, but rebolstering those current formations that exist. But like I said, even if this gets signed today, right now, it's not till minimum mid next year until you will see these guys start rocking up. And what position is Russia going to be in by then? Better or worse? I think most indicators at this point in time indicate better. Now, furthermore on the Doctrine. Military operations in attritional conflict are very distant from those in a war of manoeuvre. Instead of a decisive battle achieved through rapid manoeuvre, attritional war focuses on destroying enemy forces and their ability to regenerate combat power while preserving one's own. In this context, a successful strategy, except the war, will last at least 2 years. It's broken into 2 distinct phases. The first phase ranges from initiation of hostilities to the point where sufficient combat power has been mobilised to allow decisive action. It will see little positional shifting on the ground, focusing on favourable exchange of losses and building up combat power in the rear. The dominant form of combat is fires rather than manoeuvre, complemented by extensive fortifications and camouflage. Now, this is what I believe Russia early on in the war, they had that initial failure. Troops went in, got pounded, had to withdraw out of areas, and at this end of 22, start of 2023 is when I believe that Russia accepted this attritional warfare and that this is going to take years, not days, not weeks. And they begun phase 1. The initiation, you have little positional shifting. They used Wagner to have the positional shifting in 2023 of Bakhmut. You focused on fires and extensive fortifications and camouflage in the Surovikin line. We saw little positional shifting, but a hell of a lot of defensive positions made after that initial months of failure. Okay, then, after this, the second phase then can commence. Like I said, this is why in 23, I believe the Ukrainian counteroffensive should never have gone ahead, as it jeopardised the 2024 offensive. I don't believe that Ukraine had the upper hand in then the forces, the fortifications, or the fires to launch a successful offensive in 23, which came to be correct, but it jeopardised one being this year. So the second phase can only commence after these have been met, which is what now we are seeing. I believe that Russia, from that initiation of hostilities or the exception of attritional war, a couple of years on, then has begun the second phase this year, and this second phase was jeopardised in Ukraine by the 23 offensive. Newly mobilised forces have completed their training and gained sufficient experience to make them combat effective formations. The enemy strategic reserve is exhausted. Fire and reconnaissance superiority are achieved. We know Russia does have the fire superiority currently. The enemy's industrial sector is degraded to the point where it's unable to replace battlefield losses. In the case of fighting against a coalition of countries, their industrial resource may be exhausted or at least accounted for. So, in the West, we do know that there is a struggle to make enough shells or enough air defence, and of course what's happening in Israel doesn't help that at all. But it's not only the industrial sector of what can be made, it's also the willingness to give that hardware as well. And if you take these, Ukraine didn't tick off these before launching that 23 offensive. This says it should not have commenced, but I believe at least in the Russia hasn't achieved all of these for the 24 offensive which they have launched, but enough of them to be having success on the front line. That only after meeting these criteria should offensive operations commence. They should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks. Watch my video last night about the many front lines that Russia is pushing on currently. The intent is to remain inside a layer bubble of friendly protective systems while stretching the depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. Only then should an offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the rear. Concentration of forces on one main effort should be avoided, as it gives an indication of the offensive's location and opportunity for the enemy to concentrate their reserves against this key point. So many different points pushing, not one concentration. Can offensive extend well into the rear? Well, we'll wait and see. But with drones, we may not actually see it. Might just see a constant grind back of the front line. But we do know there was two main points in the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive, Stamorsky and Robotny. So Russia could put all their forces there, where what Russia is doing right now, because they've got the numerical advantage, because they had early mobilization and massive amounts of recruitment and huge payments to get guys, is they're just pushing on like 10 different axes at the moment. It could be more than this. Successful attritional war focused on the preservation of one's own combat power. This translates into a relatively static front interrupted by local attacks to improve positions. You're using artillery for most of the fighting. All you've been told is Russia in some fronts has a 10-to-1 artillery advantage. Fortification and concealment of all forces, including logistics, is the key to minimising losses. The long time required to construct fortifications prevents significant ground movement. End of 22 all through 23 before Russia could launch its offensive. We do know fortifications in Ukraine, there are issues. There have been a lot of questions asked about those lines repeatedly falling then rearwards also. But the preservation of one's power. That guy I've spoken about that I spoke to before, that he believes the butterfly effect of this war is all Ukraine fortifications. He said, I don't give a shit about Abrams or F-16 or this or that or that or that. The butterfly effect starts at, that, what did he say? The words were, if guys have positions of which they believe they can defend, you don't need as many guys, you don't need as many bullets, you don't need as many artillery lines, he said it all starts here and extrapolates out to problems high end, but it all starts very low level at, section, platoon level fortifications not being equipped to the point of which they should be, or even having like the night fighting capability within these. Defensive operations buy time to develop low-end combat formations. 2023, Wagner did the combat operations. Russia sat in defense, but there was a lot of development of these low-end formations, which we're seeing at the moment with some of those highly experienced guys leading some of the low-end formations into fights, motorcycle troops, all these. What was said that although Putin got rid of Wagner, they kept the experience or kept the knowledge about how that fighting actually worked. That's why I've seen more success over this year. Allowing newly mobilised troops to gain combat experience without suffering heavy losses in large-scale attacks. Defensive operations. Building up experienced low-tier combat formations generates the capability for future offensive operations. So you need this experience of low-end, and then go forward. Again, attritional warfare is one of having the best low-end formation possible. Now, people go, yeah, but Russia's losing this many more troops. Yes, but again, they have a much larger population also. I'm not convinced that the losses overall are in Ukraine's favour. We hear 10-to-1 artillery advantage. We hear 3-to-1, 6-to-1 manpower advantage. We know the fortification difference. I'm not convinced that it is more than 3 times, which what it would have to be Russia losing the attritional war. I'm not convinced of that at all. Last one. The early stage of attritional war range from the initiation of hostilities to the point where the mobilised resources are available in large numbers and are ready for combat operations. Like I said, here and now, that is still minimum 6 months away. It could be faster, but they're not going to be able to do combat offensive operations. This period lasts 1.5 to 2 years. Again, this is what I think Russia did. With this surprise offensive by one side, there was a surprise at how heavily defended Ukraine was by the Russian forces in 2022. 1.5 to 2 years of forming a solid front, solidifying that combat operations, mobilizing resources. That 1.5 to 2 years, no major offensive operations should be avoided. Wagner did the offensive operations. It wasn't the just Russian military itself, so we can't really count those losses as far as the army's combat power, if that makes sense. And now we're seeing the situation of which we're in 2024. Even if large attacks are successful, they'll result in significant casualties, often for meaningless territorial gains. And we have seen significant casualties by both sides made in areas that are meaningless territorial gains. And still, I don't think that, given in attritional war, the elements that you need to tick off before you can launch offensive operations and significant casualties, even if you are successful for territorial gains, I think Kursk is a great example of this currently. That's how I see it. So I guess the too long didn't read in the end of the video, so you're too late now, is that I believe Russia earlier on, the position that Russia's in now is because they accepted very early on the attritional phase, knew that it was going to take 1.5 to 2 years of sitting in defence, getting hammered by artillery, but to develop the low-end formations. I believe Ukraine was focused on reintroducing manoeuvre into the battlefield, which we haven't seen yet actually be able to be reintroduced by anyone, and I don't know if that's possible anymore with the drones, and a focus on an attritional positive ratio, which I don't bloody know either. It would still need to be very high. But also that Ukraine is seemingly not willing to conscript and risk its generation, of which haven't had children yet. But could this risk everything? Or could recruiting them anyway, could that risk even more? If that makes sense. Are you risking a future generation for 20%, 25%? That is a calculation of which I would hate to be in the position of making because of the fallouts from this. Legends, have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.